So, I mean, you mentioned China. This is a bit of a pivot, but I am curious about your thoughts on. I mean, this has been long foretold, the pivot to Asia. We've effectively wrecked the Middle East, and we got a bunch of Middle Eastern countries to come to the side of Israel. So that means that the United States has influence there, and we also have oil partnerships with them. So all right, like the West has ruined the Middle East enough. So now we're increasing militarism towards China. The reopening of 4 Philippines bases that have been defunct for a while, but were United States colonial operations in China's back door, plus our agreements with Australia, so we have more weaponry on the coast of China, and then this news from yesterday about 600 million in arms potentially going to Taiwan. What is the end game here? And as somebody who studies U.S. policy in the Middle East, what are your number one concerns?
It's hard to nail down the number one concern. I think in general, so much of what is driving this is the capture of US politics by the weapons industry, which has systematically taken control of our political process. They've been very intentional in making sure that every member of Congress has some kind of weapons manufacturing in their district, such that if that were to be cut, they would have their constituents saying, why, we want to keep these jobs, which is part of why we're seeing these massive military budgets being pushed through, that Congress allocating even more money than Biden himself had requested, which was already beyond, what we'd seen under Trump. Mm-hmm. At a time when we are not we're not fighting the war in Iraq anymore. We pulled out of Afghanistan. We're not yet involved in a war with China. And so this question of how much money would be involved in actually trying to fight China, let alone the risk of nuclear apocalypse. This is not just invading and subjugating a much weaker country like Iraq. I mean, this is going against a fellow nuclear armed power whose economy rivals our own. So I think my number one fear is that people may have this notion that, well, we won the Cold War against the Soviet Union, or, the war in Iraq wasn't great, but, it wasn't that big of a deal, because for many Americans, our all volunteer force, many people don't feel directly the impact of what that war meant, whether it was for U.S. veterans or for populations in the Middle East, for Iraqis, for the many other.
The 1 million dead Iraqis, that doesn't translate domestically.
Well, and just, you look at the figures coming out of the Cost of War Project, looking at, the impact of the entire war on terror in terms of civilians killed. The numbers are really shocking. So that's my fear, is there's kind of this notion that we can afford this, or, if we were to fight this war, a war with China, whether it's a new Cold War or a hot war with China, that it's okay because we would win. Is really alarming. I don't think people understand what that would actually mean. Furthermore, I think it's very hard for people to understand what has been lost in the extent to which so much money goes to our military, the extent to which so many of these weapons are then turned around through things like the 1033 program, such that, unwanted military equipment is just donated to local police forces. And so then you have military grade equipment being used on US citizens at no cost to the police. They have access to all of this excess military equipment because we're overfunding the military with equipment that it doesn't even want, but that continues to be manufactured because the member of Congress voted for it, because they want to keep those jobs. And the way to address this is to shift away, to have a new industrial policy that does not promote and continue to fund the military industrial complex, but instead shifts to what Americans actually need, which are things like green energy and education and healthcare and a less police-based system. There are lots of jobs that if we chose to, we could be funding those kinds of things instead of directing trillions of dollars of American taxpayer money to our military, and largely to military contractors who then, end up spending mountains of money. When some of my colleagues have really dug into this, some of the work of people like Bill Hartung, for example, my colleague at the Quincy Institute, just looking at the gouging of the Pentagon by military contractors, because there's no competition. They can charge whatever they want.
And also, I mean, you look at the audits, the multiple failures of the Pentagon. It's just that amount of waste would never be tolerated in any other part of our government, and yet the Pentagon consistently, on a yearly basis, fails audits because just
Absolutely.
Billions unaccounted for.
Absolutely.
And it occurs to me that it's just the CHIPS Act and the push for more domestic manufacturing. I mean, in and of itself, I'm good with, right? I mean, especially if, like, say, there's protections for like union labor and other things. But it seems like the Biden administration and other Democrats feel like they cannot pass a domestic agenda of that nature without it tying it to anti-China hawkery. And then that just cracks the door open for a very eager military industrial complex that wants all these arms sales, and we're off to the races. And the Biden administration, this is going to go down as a deep, deep failure. This policy of a continued aggressiveness towards China, I'm very worried. I'm not sure, but I know you are. But to me, this is an example of an empire in complete decline, where we have no idea how to exert our state power outside of the context of increased military presence abroad. Because even our domestic agenda is in that context.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you that we don't really know how to handle this. That essentially the past 70 years or so, since World War II, the U.S. has pursued this policy of primacy, of being the most powerful military actor in the world. And since the end of the Cold War, we were able to do that without too much trouble. And yet now, in this context of now a multipolar world, where specifically we have China, although also Russia, reasserting or asserting themselves, U.S. policymakers, the U.S. foreign policy establishment doesn't know how to handle that except to throw more money at the military and to try to push for, our allies around the world to line up on our side against China or against Russia. And many of these countries are not interested in doing so. They don't want to antagonize China or Russia. They have lucrative trade relations. Their economies depend on engaging with these countries, and they don't want to be pushed to choose. And if they are forced to choose, we might not like the decision they make. Mm-hmm. They might not line up on our side. And so the fact that the choice at the moment does seem to be things like, well, we can't pressure a country like Saudi Arabia because what if they go over to China? They're already going over to China. China is already their largest customer largest purchaser of Saudi oil. And they're already purchasing, they're diversifying their military procurement process. I mean, this is not something the U.S. can really stop them from doing. And instead of freaking out about that, the fact that we might lose our status as the world's biggest arms dealer, we should be investing in other aspects of our economy, no longer prioritizing the U.S. weapons industry and providing it with such massive benefits and kickbacks and subsidies, but thinking about what does a future multipolar world look like, where the United States is not the global hegemon, and what do the American people want? You know, Americans by and large do not want more war.
Yeah, I completely agree.